Welcome to Messy Liberation, the podcast that dives deep into feminism, business, and personal growth. I'm Becky Mollenkamp.
And I'm Taina Brown. Get ready for another messy conversation through the eyes of two intersectional feminist coaches.
Let's get messy.
Hi, Taina.
Hi.
Look at me. I'm sitting in if you're watching on YouTube, I have a new area I'm sitting in. And I love it because it showcases how similar our wallpapers are.
Yeah.
That's
your reading corner, right?
It's my little reading nook that has become a bit of my office nook because I have a little, the whole setup allows my dog to lay with me, which in a way that's more comfortable for both of us than when she tries to sit in my lap while I'm working at my desk. So this is becoming my primary office space, which is workspace, which is ridiculous. But anyway, the things we do for the dogs we love.
Yeah. Change is good.
Yeah.
Little change in environment can procure some creativity.
Yeah. And also I'm in a place of wanting to have a lot of comfort and coziness. And this little area feels more cozy than my desk. And I think for a fun little segue into what we're talking about here, me trying to this is truthful, that it is cozy, but also I was like, this might work to segue into what we're talking about because the world is on fire and heavy. And every day it feels like there is a new ton of bricks thrown at me. And when I'm feeling that overwhelmed by everything that's happening, I'm just like, I just want a cocoon, but not in a way necessarily of hiding, but just of tending to myself, giving myself that permission to feel
safe space.
Yeah. And I feel this sort of safety in this little corner where I have a blanket and, and I'm in a comfy chair with a pillow. And so, yeah, I've just been trying to in a lot of ways, think about how do I give myself that safety and care when I am dealing with boatloads of trauma. We all are.
Yeah. My safety space is we purchased this recliner when we first bought our house almost a year ago. And for years, my wife Mello has been I want a recliner. And I'm just they're ugly, they're bulky, I just don't want one. And when we moved in here, I was like, you know what? We've been through it all. Let's get the recliner to so she can have this, what she wants, her heart's desire or whatever. And so I found this love seat recliner on Target, which we won't talk about Target right now, but,
yeah, it was pre-DEI.
It was pre-DEI backlash.
The changes, yeah.
Pre-Trump. Second term. But, and so I was like, this would be great because we can both sit on it and we can watch movies together. And we do that sometimes, but I've kind of taken it over as my napping, laying down, cozy chair. And so every time I sit down in it, she's like, can I sit next to you? And I'm like, I was going to lay down. No, you can't. So sometimes I feel bad, but
funny enough, just now, right before this call, just confirmed on Marketplace, and same deal with Facebook Meta. There's just not a great replacement for Marketplace. Sadly, it took over Craigslist, and now there's it's really the only way to sort of go about it. But anyway,
yeah,
all that to say, I just bought a recliner for this space because as much as I love this chair, and I think it's so stylish, and I really love the way it looks in the room, and it is more comfortable than my office chair. It's not the most comfortable. And now that I've been sitting here working, I'm like, ooh, I think I have to get something different.
Yeah.
Is about a recliner. And it's not the most attractive chair. But honestly, I'm like, I don't care because it was inexpensive. I'm paying $75 for this recliner. And so that'll work for now. And I think it speaks to where so many of us are of when we're in this state of overwhelm and sadness and grief, you need ways to just really cope. Yeah. Tend to yourself. So I have a feeling we're not alone. I wonder if recliner sales are just going up in general right now.
Yeah. I think people are looking, at least people that I know, people in my circles, are really looking for ways to cope right now when they have the ability to slow down. I feel like so much is happening so fast that it feels like we're moving at the speed of light and there's no real time to just kind of process and absorb.
Which of course is by design, this whole thing that the Trump administration's doing.
Yes, definitely by design to keep us distracted and overwhelmed and not attuned to ways that we can like really fight back and resist. And so I thought it would, or we discussed talking about grief today. And I think usually when we think about grief, we think about loss, like the loss of a person, of a life. And there are so many facets to grief that we sometimes don't take or don't really have the time to consider. And I think for a lot of us right now, we are grieving what could have been. We are grieving the beliefs or ideas that we had about people that turned out to not be true, for, in terms of like the data on who voted for what, right? People who might have family members who just really voted against their own best interests, but against, people in their families as well, against the interests of people in their families. And I think there's a grief for a world that we thought we were going to walk into on November 6th or November 7th here in the US that was just kind of snatched out. It's like the rug just kind of like got pulled out from under us. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I was just looking at like the definition of grief, because I agree. Most people think of it as death. Like that's where we most often hear it. When we hear about grief counseling, it's usually around the death of someone. But grief is just a emotional response to loss. And loss can look like a lot of things. And as you mentioned, it can look like the loss of a life you thought you would have, a life that you thought you wanted, or even, and this is always weird for people too, a life that you didn't want, but that you knew, right? But it's still a loss. Oh, a divorce. There's so much grief often around divorce. And it can be one of those things that gets people confused. Like, why am I, like, I wanted this, especially if it's a divorce you wanted, like, and it's for the best. And yet there's like all of the sadness and stuff that can come up, and it can be confusing because you're like, I wanted this thing. This is the life I'm moving towards that I'm excited about. Why am I still dealing with this like loss or the sadness when I don't really feel like I'm losing or I wanted or something, but it's a loss of the life that you knew. Right.
Yeah.
So like there are so many ways that loss shows up. I remember when I had my miscarriage and I was 10 weeks pregnant. I had no bump. I didn't, I hadn't even seen the baby. I mean, we did, but at that point, the tissue was no longer viable. But like, I hadn't really developed an emotional attachment to a human in any way. I remember feeling like, why am I feeling so sad? Like, I mean, it's sad that it happened, but like, it's not like I didn't understand it because it was like this. Whereas when I had an abortion, I didn't have that same kind of feeling because it was something I wanted, a choice I made that I wanted, which again, there's also grief that can happen there. But I couldn't understand. My mom was like, well, you had already started to picture like this future that was going to look different. And this is just about the loss of that vision you had.
Yeah.
And that's valid and real. And I think that that's the same thing with what so many of us are experiencing right now is like, even if because I have seen some people on social media and I get the instinct to want to be like, I told you so, or I knew, or whatever, like this sort of a bit of superiority attitude of like, well, I knew this was going to happen, or we told you like this whole thing. And I get that. And yeah, I think you can know it's going to happen and still be feeling grief, right?
Yeah.
Like,
yeah.
I knew Trump was going to be sworn in. I had a feeling he might even win, right? Like I was still holding this hope that he wouldn't, but like I wasn't surprised by what's happened. But it doesn't mean I'm still not going to feel grief, right? Because it is a loss of a dream I have for this country and for how a loss of belief in people and choices that they might make and all of that. So like, while I understand that instinct to kind of be like, we knew and like, get over yourselves. This is a big deal. Like, you knew it was going to happen. We all knew this was going to happen. We told you so. I think if we can think of this moment in time as grief and as loss, then the way you're showing up,
changes.
How sensitive is that to be like, well, you should have known. It's like saying, well, your dad's had cancer for months. Of course you knew he was going to die.
Yeah.
Get over it. I told you this was going to happen. Why are you so upset? Why are you so surprised? maybe they're not surprised, but they're just grieving. And we need to be able to hold space for people in this moment, even if our instinct, even if everything in us is wanting to be like, I knew it and I told you so, and F you for not figuring that out. That's not an invitation into change.
Yeah.
And it's hard because I am the kind of person who's usually like, fuck everybody, like, fuck MAGA, fuck anyone who doesn't agree with me.
Yeah.
But there is a part of me that's like, these people are having buyer's remorse even.
Yeah.
Well, I want to be like, what'd you think was going to happen? And fuck off. And there is that part of me. When I can reframe what's happening into this like grief place of, oh my gosh, they thought this was going to look a certain way. Maybe they should have known better. Maybe they should have, but it isn't. And they're grieving. Like, if I can meet them where they're at with that grief, that's going to make a big difference. Because just like when you're grieving that loss of a loved one, the person who says, well, you knew they were going to die. What's the big deal?
Everybody dies. Yeah.
Those people are not the people we want to have in our lives. But the people who come up to you and say, my God, this is hard. I'm sorry. And I know it's not what you thought it was going to be. But, you know, I'm here to help you through this now. Right? That's the person they're going to respond to. And so I think it's important for us to think about that as the folks who maybe have some of that inclination to be like, well, what'd you think was going to happen?
Yeah.
Maybe if we can find some of that empathy.
Yeah.
Look at this as like a grieving moment. That might make a difference in how people behave moving forward.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree. And, you know, to add a layer of complexity to that, you know, I think Black women have like been grieving for centuries. And I posted this TikTok. I think it was last week. It feels like last year, but it was just last week. Is January ever going to fucking end? And it was about the announcement of, you know, ICE being able to go into hospitals and churches and schools now. Well, it's basically just saying, you know, if you work at a hospital or church or school, that you need to have a plan right now for when ICE shows up. You can't wait until they show up to have a plan because it'll be too late by then. Someone commented, a Black woman, you know, which, and again, I get where she's coming from, 100% get where she's coming from, but she commented, you know, they voted for him, let them leave. And I was just like, and this was her second comment in a series of just like a little bit of back and forth. And so her first comment was just, you know, like, because I basically was comparing it to like the civil rights movement and the Holocaust. And like a lot of people are always like, if I were alive back then, what would I have done? And I'm like, well, this is your moment to find out. Like we've been saying that for years, but like for real now, feet to the fire. And her first comment was just like, you can't compare the two because nobody's being thrown into ovens and nobody's being killed and it's different. And they voted for him anyway or something. And I was just like blown away by the callousness. And again, I totally get like there's a whole like 92% movement on social media of just like, well, 92% of Black women voted not for Donald Trump. So we're just going to sit back and like watch the world burn. And it's like, okay, what happened in November at this point is irrelevant because we're all in this shit together now and we all have to find a way to cope out of this. There's that attitude, I think, doesn't make room for grief, right? Not just for other people that are grieving, even for Black women to grieve, because it takes this posture of, like you said, almost like a little bit of a superiority and this posture of like, well, I told you so. It's more of an angry posture as opposed to a posture of just like really coming to terms with the reality that we're in. And I don't think that those two things are mutually exclusive.
Well, I was going to say, that's stages of grief.
Angry.
Yeah,
like,
those are stages of grief.
Angry. But also like, let yourself grieve and let yourself have empathy and compassion for other people that are grieving too. And I think one of the things that we misunderstand about grief sometimes is that we think of it as steps. And that's not the case, right? Like grief is like a funnel that you're popping in and out of. And so you might be angry today and feel like you moved on into acceptance and, you know, tomorrow. And then next week you get angry all over again because something triggered you or because, you know, you're thinking about it in a different way that you hadn't considered before. And so, there's collective trauma that we have been enduring. It's like being in an abusive relationship, right? And so there's a level of trauma that I don't think a lot of people have dealt with. And instead they just like stay angry. But anger is just a part of grief. Like it's not the whole part of grief. And to just stay in anger, you're just letting that trauma build up as opposed to like working through it and processing. So that way you can then move on and be like, okay, what do I do now?
Well, the 5 stages of grief, as they talk about in psychology, and yes, they are not linear, but often people think it moves in this like order where you end at acceptance. Acceptance generally is where you arrive, but you can arrive there and still sort of go back and then back and forth. But a lot of this is like circular, right? You're moving around these things. But the stages of grief are denial, which often comes first, but not always, right? Sometimes we are not in denial for a while. Anger, for some people, that's the first place they go. Bargaining, which is where I hear a lot of the stuff we're talking about here, where people are talking about how they could have prevented it, right? That's kind of what this bargaining is like, oh, if I had only done this, if I had only done that, which I think is in some ways where I feel like there is this feeling of folks who didn't vote for him of like, well, if you had just listened to me, if you would have just voted the way I said, but it didn't happen, right? That is not forward progress. That's staying, and it, same that denial is, or anger, and then depression, and then acceptance. And I think that so many of us are in different spaces, but without meeting people where they are and recognizing that we're all on the same journey, even if we're in different places on the journey, and maybe not all of us, there is still that 30% who are just like, it doesn't matter. He can shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue and I'm still going to love him and I'm going to celebrate. Yeah. Okay, those people are going to get, there's still like 60, 70% of Americans who are in some form of grief right now, right? Because that the ones who voted for him, that 20% who voted for him but aren't part of his like 30% no matter what people, they're feeling some grief too. Yeah. Right? And that's hard because for many of us, that's hard to see. And to see it as that, and to be able to be with that without the anger or the bargaining or the, depression or whatever it is. But it doesn't help any of us, because what helps us, and also, I guess I want to speak as the white woman in the room to what you were talking about with Black women, because also I'm not saying that Black women, in no way would I ever say you have to show up this way, what you're doing is wrong or anything else, because I can't imagine having an ancestral lineage of hundreds of years of being in grief, right? And then having other people finally sort of showing up and being like, oh, I totally get it now. Like, that's hard. That's gotta be like beyond hard. So I think Black women need to tend to each other. I think that, that how you show up is gotta be different. And so when I'm speaking, I just want to be super clear that I'm only speaking to folks who have a lot of privilege in this situation. Yeah. And so for folks like me, I think it's even more imperative that we don't join in that chorus of, hey, well, we told you we knew, because it's a different scenario. It's kind of comparing apples and oranges. Right. Yeah. And so I think for those of us with a lot of privilege to show up and say, how can I see your grief and know that even while I'm in anger, or your grief brings up my anger or brings up my bargaining or brings up the depression, we are still both in the same journey now. Because we can go back to November 4th, but what good does that do us? Because we can't literally, we are all here now. Yeah. So what do we do now? Because I think so much of what you and I want to talk about is like liberation. And liberation doesn't happen by sitting in past, right? Yeah. Liberation is now and future focused. It is, what do we do now to get us to where we want to go? Me being angry about how you voted, like, I get there's a time for that, because that is part of this grief process. But at some point, I have to recognize it is not serving any purpose other than to fuel my anger. Yeah. But it's not actually it's not moving us towards the destination I want. It is not helping it create liberation. And I say all of this as somebody who, like, I am preaching to myself, because this is so hard for me to do too. Yeah. Like, I can feel every bit of me inside wanting to be like, fuck you and we told you so. But I feel like a lot of that is probably grounded in some white supremacy culture stuff too. Yeah. With that perfectionism and all. Yeah.
Yeah, it's been rough. Like I'm not sure that I've like fully allowed myself to feel like everything that's like going on internally over the past like few weeks.
And by few weeks, by the way, he was sworn in on the 20th.
Yeah,
As we record
last
this, we
week.
are talking 9 days. By the time it comes out, it'll be
Yeah,
like,
yeah,
2 weeks. That's it. And yet
yeah,
it feels already like it's been months or years of it. And it's like, yeah, so it's hard. And I get it. And the whole point, like you said, it's this shock and awe, as they called it,
yeah,
for that very reason you said, to like keep us in this place so that we can't process any of it.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And so am I am trying to find a way to work through the grief in a way that is conducive to my capacity right now. And so while also maintaining that I have to show up as a business owner, as a coach. Like, well, I mean, we're both coaches. Part of our role is to help guide people. How do we do that while also like processing our own shit, right? And so so I've just kind of been in this place of just like trying to take it as slow as possible, not having unrealistic expectations of myself. And when I feel it's necessary, to like talk things out with like my wife or friends or even here on the podcast, right? And so it feels weird to just like, it feels almost like being in limbo. Like you're not, like I'm not fully grieving, but I'm also not fully hopeful. I'm just kind of like in between.
Yeah.
I'm just kind of like dipping my toe in each of those spaces at different times. And so I sent an email out to my email list this morning because it's on the day that we recorded this, it's Lunar New Year. And my wife is Asian and she's part Chinese. And so that's why I'm
She a
wearing
snake, because I know it's the year of the snake.
It's the year of the snake. Yeah, it's the year of the snake.
I'm a rabbit.
Envelopes. I'm a cock.
Right.
Yeah, we had trouble finding red envelopes to give people money in, but we eventually found them. We have like our mandarins. We've got the whole thing that that we're doing to celebrate. And so I sent an email to my email list this morning about the year of the snake and what that means. A lot of the themes around that is just about shedding old skins, right? And how shedding the old makes way for the new. But when you're in the process of shedding, like it just looks gross and messy. Like it doesn't look good. It doesn't feel good. And how we really have to just trust that like every destruction is a birthplace for something new. And even as I was writing that, I'm like, do I fucking believe this? Like right now, it doesn't feel like I believe this, but I know that that is a circumstantial feeling. That's not how Hyena really feels about things, right? And so, and I think it's important for us to like understand the differences between that, right? Between temporary feelings, circumstantial feelings versus like who we truly are at our core. And the values that I hold at my core, I do believe that every destruction is the birthplace for something new. However, the way that I'm feeling right now, it's hard to hold on to that belief. It's hard to grasp that belief because I'm seeing so much destruction around me. And I think that's part of the grieving process too, like being able to like discern what temporary and external versus like what is really at the core of who you are and like what the things that you really need to like try your hardest to hold on to during those temporary moments. Yeah, it's been fucking weird.
Well, and I think that part that you were talking about of like this weird place that we all find ourselves in of the world feels like it's burning and my bills don't stop just because of that.
Yeah.
Right. Like we're not in a place where the world is shut down. I mean, even like in those, like the early days of the pandemic when we were on this like lockdown, the world felt shut down. And yet mortgage companies were still asking for their money. I mean, there was some pausing of things, but like, we're not even having that. There's no like, hey, let's all take a break.
It's like a beat. Yeah.
Right. And it's funny because I saw, well, not funny. It kind of pissed me off. But I saw somebody on Blue Sky who I really respect saying the world's burning and people are just sending out, like, I got an email from somebody I respect trying to pitch me something. And I'm like, the world's burning down. Come on, people. We need to all focus on that. And I'm like, that's a really privileged take.
Mhm.
You say we're all supposed to what? Quit our job, quit everything and do nothing but get out on the streets and revolt. And like, there's every part of me that wants to do that.
Yeah.
And I got to make money. And the thing that's even more scary is my livelihood feels even more threatened. So I'm
Yeah.
feeling even more panicked to try and make more money because I'm so scared of, the economic realities of what are coming, that I'm like, I need to even double down more on working now versus working less, because I don't have that
Yeah.
kind of privileged position to be able to say, I just don't have to work. I can just go and riot and protest and whatever. And like, as much as I would love to do nothing but, and it's hard for me to focus on other things, I'm in this, we're all in this place of like, I think part of the grief is this feeling of I should be grieving all the time and I got to work, which is so similar to when I've had losses in my life of people where you're
Mhm.
like, wait a minute. I mean, I remember when my brother died, it was like, I'm supposed to I remember distinctly that feeling of, so everyone gave me a couple of days, right? Because in America, grief is supposed to last 3 days. That's what most
Yeah.
employers will give you. And that's only
Yeah.
for the closest people in your life,
Yeah.
right? So forget about a friend where you get like an
Yeah.
hour or two to
Or
go
a
to the
cousin
funeral,
that really close to. Yeah.
right? No, you just get an hour to go to the funeral. But for like your parent or your child or your sibling, you get 3 days, most usually.
If you're lucky. Yeah.
Exactly, right? That's even super privileged. And I remember I was self-employed at the time, so I didn't get bereavement leave, but I remember like the funeral and the things and people kind of sending flowers and saying things. And then there felt like there was this shift where everyone else went about their lives again. And not long before I started to feel almost this pressure of people saying like, they didn't say it, but this feeling of like, okay, like, are you done now? Like, you ready to get back? Like, come on, you're making us uncomfortable with your grief. Like,
Yeah.
let's get back to life. And I just remember this feeling of like, how am I supposed to like ever function normally again? Now I'm so far removed from my brother's death that I can say eventually you do, right? I'm coming up on 15 years this year. Eventually, yeah, you do function again and you do go about life. And it just comes up in these moments where you see
Yeah.
something that makes you think of them or an anniversary of something comes up. But in those first years, not days, years for me after, I was in this place of like, what the fuck do you mean I have to function like a normal human? And I looked at everyone else and thought, how are you all functioning as
Yeah.
normal? And that was when it was just my thing. And now I'm looking at all of us going like, I don't know about you, but when I'm out in the world moving about right now, I look at people and I think like, are you guys all feeling as fucked up?
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like, I don't feel okay. Are you okay? And yet we're all like going to the gas pump or picking our kids
Yeah.
up at school or heading to the grocery store. And I think like, I just look at everyone through a different lens at the moment of going like, are you internally freaking out as much as I am? And I'm just going through the motions. So maybe you're just going through the motions,
Yeah.
but like we
Yeah.
have to go through the motions. So it
Yeah.
is just a really hard thing to grapple with.
Yeah. Yeah. It's funny because like we went to the grocery store. I think this was like on Friday, and like people are not okay. Based on the driving in the parking lot, I was like, we need to get the fuck back home because people are not okay out here. Like we saw almost like, no lie, 3 or 4 accidents just in the parking lot of the grocery store. It felt so bizarre. I was like, what are just people just like forget how to drive? Like, and I think people are just like so distracted and
Angry,
so
distracted.
overwhelmed,
Yeah.
angry. Yeah. That they're just like not really attuned to things that they normally are.
Or they're taking it out with like road rage. And,
Right. And I think it's really important to like understand, one, like we've been saying, like grief is a process, but it's a process that you have to intentionally choose. Like you don't process grief just because it's a process. Like you have to choose to process it. You have to choose to deal with it. Otherwise, it just will show up in these ways that you are not wanting it to show up. And like, I just went through like a somatic CBT training, and like, it's not just the like, oh, it shows up by you being angry or short with people and starting fights or being a bad driver, but like you also hold that shit in your body, like that stress that you hold in your body. And I know like there's a lot of shit out there where people are like, we hold grief in our stomachs or we hold grief in our back. And that's bullshit. Like everybody holds grief in a different place or in a different way. Like we're all unique, and so not everyone's going to respond to grief in the same somatic way. So if you see shit like that, just know that it's not real. But it's also important to just like release that energy out of your body. Like when we got back from the grocery store, I was so worked up. I just like, as soon as we came inside, like I went into my kitchen and I had to like just shake it out like really violently because there was just so much anxious energy in me from like being around all the parking lot bullshit that was happening, that I was just like, I got to release this because otherwise I'm not going to be able to sleep tonight. I'm going to be worked up or whatever. But I wanted to just like go back to something that you said earlier about how like you saw someone on Blue Sky, you know, like kind of critiquing getting an email for an offering or something. I used to be that person that's like, oh, you shouldn't, you know, you got to give people time or whatever. I stopped being that person for two reasons. One, my business is not going to run itself. So like as the CEO, as the business owner, like the business has to keep functioning and it's not going to happen on its own. So I have to do it. And then two, also, that feels like obeying in advance to me. Like it feels like sacrificing something that I'm not ready or willing to sacrifice for the sake of like the chaos, right? It feels like playing into that game of just like letting myself be distracted and letting myself just be thrown off to the point where I can't do anything. And I know not every business owner feels like their business is their activism work, but I do.
And I do too. And I think a lot of folks attracted to us would show up that same way.
Yeah.
I just made available in my shop, smashingpatriarchy.com. I just made a do not obey in advance shirt.
Oh, I saw that. It looks so good.
Yeah. I'm getting one for myself for that. And that just a reminder of like, what are the ways that we are doing that? Because, and I do see it the same way as I hadn't thought of it, but as you say it, because it is this whole shock and awe thing is by design to make us want to hole up, right? And just be in a state of depression and paralyzed by fear and overwhelm. And I think that one way we don't do that is we continue to say, no, I'm going to earn a living. I'm going to make money so that I can feed my family, right? So that I don't end up not being able to feed my family and then even more at the whims of your power and control over me. And so I do think you're right in that.
Yeah.
I don't want just to shift our focus, if it's okay, because I want to make sure we're mindful of our time. I do think something that's helpful is talking about how do we deal with grief? Because you're saying like we have to be with the grief. We have to like feel the grief. I always tell people like you can run from grief, but it will catch you because grief has one job. Grief's only job is to be felt, right? And so it's going to go and go until you do it or you drop dead and don't do it. But like until you feel it, it will be there haunting you, begging you to be there with it. So I think what are the things that help you, like thinking back on times where you've been in a grieving process? Because, you know, like I said, I've had a miscarriage. I lost my brother. I had a divorce. Those are just some of the big ways I've experienced grief. But then there's also all the small things that happen throughout our, you know, a job change or whatever. I've had a lot of experience with grief. I'm sure you have as well. I don't think you can get very far into this human experience without learning about
grieving.
Yeah. So what are the things that have helped you? I'm assuming based on what you just said, somatics are a part of it. So maybe start there, but I'd love to hear some yours and then I'll tell you some of mine that maybe you don't cover.
Yeah. So I think for me, I'm very sensitive to like stimulation. And there's a lot of external stimulation happening day in and day out between social media, like outside noise, you know, family, dogs, like work. There's just so much external stuff that I'm also really good at like focusing on the external stuff and not the internal stuff. Like I'm just like, oh no, I'll do that. And that'll take care of it, right? Like I'm good at disassociating that way. And so for me, the best way that I have found to like process my grief is like cutting off as much external stimulation as possible. Like sitting in silence, sitting in a silent room by myself where I have nowhere to run from my thoughts and my feelings, and doing so intentionally, right? Doing so when I feel like, okay, I'm ready. And so I think it's important to know like understand like where you're at, to have the self-awareness to understand where you're at and when you're ready to deal with things and when you're not ready to deal with things. And so when I feel like, okay, I'm feeling like it's time to like get through this, that's usually what I'll do. Like I'll go for a drive sometimes, keep the windows up, turn the radio off, or I'll just like go up to the bedroom and just sit by myself, and maybe journal a little bit, just think for a while. And I will say, like, I didn't get to the point of having that self-awareness, and I'm still not like 100% self-aware. There are definitely times where my wife is like calling me out because I'm just like blind to my own tactics. But therapy helps a lot with developing a healthy sense of self-awareness. And because I have been in therapy for years, I feel like I can manage some of that on my own now. If you feel like you can't manage some of that on your own, then I think that's an indication that like you should probably be talking to a licensed therapist who can help you make sense of what you're feeling. And I know that not everyone can afford that, and so I understand that there's a privilege there as well. But if you at least know that, then I think that can kind of help you get started on moving through that process. And then when I'm ready, talking about it out loud is really hard for me a lot of times. And so I need a lot of quiet solitude to just kind of process on my own before I'm ready to talk about it out loud.
Yeah. Yeah, I can relate to a lot of those things. The solitude piece for me is also really big as an introvert and somebody who's very internally focused. So one of the things that I wanted to bring up was the book Burnout by the Nagoski sisters, which isn't about grief. And yet so much of it is actually really related to grief, because grief, I find, can often, especially when you're not dealing with it, can manifest itself in a lot of like stress and tension in our bodies, like because we're suppressing the grief. And so that it's becoming this sort of stress feeling. Yeah. And so the things that they share in that book about managing stress before it becomes burnout. So, and I feel like it's so related to ways to actually be with your grief before it consumes you. And I can say this as somebody, I ran for 2 years from my grief after my brother's death. I stayed in denial and like, I was just not being with the grief. I was like, how far can I run? Because it was so overwhelming to even think about that. I was like, I just can't do it. I did everything I could to not have to grieve. And eventually it caught me, and it was, I am certain, so much harder than it needed to have been if I could have learned, or if I could have allowed myself to feel it from the beginning and throughout that time. It was like a pressure. If I could have let the pressure valve, like be releasing pressure that whole 2 years instead of it, blowing at the end of 2 years. So the things that they talk about, and I recommend this book to everybody because I just think it's so helpful for everything. So grief, yes, but also just like dealing with stress of life. And there's so much of that. But so they outline like 6 ways to deal with stress to help you kind of complete the stress cycle. And I think all of these things help with grief. One of them is breathing. So like that's huge for me. And I know it sounds stupid because it's like, well, I always breathe, but they're talking about deep, slow, conscious, intentional breathing. And that is always still by far the number one thing that works for me, whether I'm feeling stress or sadness or anything else, is if I can breathe, I can start to regulate my nervous system to be able to be with whatever it is so it doesn't get overwhelming.
Yeah. And that's a somatic practice.
Exactly. Well, and another one is laughter, which when we think about grief, we often think like, I remember like, how is I'm supposed to have fun? Like the world is ending. I can't have fun. But I think that's part of that whole joy sponge thing I talked about back at the end of the year of like, I want to soak up all this joy because I need to be able to, as it gets wrung out of me, I want to have plenty. And I need to pull from that joy too. I need to laugh. Yesterday, I was feeling the weight of the world really heavy, and I sat down and watched a show called Taskmaster, which I love on BBC. It is delightful and silly and stupid, and it just makes me laugh. It's just comedians completing these random tasks and trying to figure out how to do it in the like most efficient way, and it ends up being hilarious. I sat on YouTube and I watched that for probably 2 hours and laughed, and I felt so much better. Laughter, it's another somatic thing and that helps us with clearing the synapse. And obviously similar is crying. just a big old cry, which is where therapy can help, talking about it can help, but also journaling. That's, for me, as somebody who doesn't necessarily always want to talk about it yet, journaling allows me to do it. What I have found for me is like being out in nature, going for long walks, listening to sad music. Like I can force myself into tears sometimes by just choosing music that kind of makes me sad. Yeah. Which you think, why do I want to do that? Because we got to get it out. And that's,
you got to release. Yeah.
So there's some of the somatic ways, but then, in affection, like hugs, holding hands, right? Just being with people who can give you some like physical affection can also be helpful. And that's another physical somatic way of processing. And then a couple of their maybe slightly less physical, but still somatic is being with your friends, just having positive social interactions. Because sometimes like we can find ourselves wanting to pull up, and both of us have admitted, we can get very like insular at these times, but we need to resist the temptation to be only with ourselves. We need community. Yeah. We don't have to be talking about the grief, right? But we need to be with others during hard times, whether we're stressed or going through grief. So finding ways to be with friends, family, even if you set that ground rule, that boundary of like, I don't want to talk about what's happening in the world. I can't do that. I can't process that right now. I just need to be with somebody. Come watch a show with me, or let's go to lunch, or let's like sit next to each other and knit, whatever the thing is you do. And then the last one is creative expression. So finding creative outlets, even if you don't think of yourself as a creative person, but I know that I did like collage projects during that time when I was grieving my brother specifically. Lately, I've been feeling that pull again to like do some art projects. And it's your body's way of processing things, your brain's way of processing things before maybe you're ready to talk about it. So those are some things that I think are helpful. And the only other one that they don't mention that I found that I think is super, super important to remember when we're grieving is to ask for help. Yeah. We continue to function in this deeply American individualistic way during grief to think like, I can do this. I'm tough. I can ride this out. I don't need anybody to help me. Like, I'll be fine. I'll make it all work. And sometimes we need help. We need help with like, I can't function today. I need somebody to come help watch my child, or can someone else come make dinner? Can someone else, do the transport today on something? Can somebody else go get my groceries or pick up the prescription? Whatever the thing is, don't be afraid to ask for help. We need help. And this is where that like mutual aid kind of stuff we've talked about comes into play too. Like, how do we support each other during this time? Because we all need help right now.
Yeah. Yeah. One thing I'll add to that list also is just rest. I think sometimes because there's so much being thrown at us, we're too tired to grieve. And so rest is sometimes like step 0, like just rest, just make sure you get some good rest. So that way you can like feel like, okay, now I can like really think about what's happening. And so that has been beneficial for me too. Like I have taken times when, like I remember when I was like almost done with college, barely had any money, but decided to like book a hotel at the beach for a weekend and drive 4 hours to the beach. And like some people, they weren't like friends, but people that I knew, they were like, are you fucking crazy? Like, you don't have money for this. Like, why are you doing this? And I'm like, I need rest. And this is the way. Like, it seems counterintuitive. And I'm not advocating that everyone should be spending money that they feel like they don't have. But even a nap. You get to decide, but you get to decide for yourself what rest looks like. Like, you get to exercise your agency in that way. And whatever that looks like, tap into it so you can have the energy and the mental and emotional space to then like deal with what's in front of you.
I'm so glad you mentioned rest, because this is a marathon, not a sprint. And if 9 days has felt like a year, I don't even want to think about what 4 years is going to feel like. Yeah. And there's no way we can get through this and have the energy that we are all going to need to fight, to resist, to support each other, all of it, to take collective action if we don't rest. So I think that's a great place for us to end too, is just rest up. It's going to be a long 4 years, but you're not alone in it. Your grief, if there's any silver lining at all, is sometimes I think grieving an individual can feel very different, because it's like your immediate family, whatever, but the rest of the world is moving on and they're not even attuned to why you're feeling the way you are. In this scenario, like you said, you go out and you can just feel the electricity in the air of everyone. So many people, 70% of us, feeling that some degree of the same grief, right? And so there is something to that too, to know we're not alone in it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We're here for you.
Yeah. All right. Thanks for listening, everyone.
Thanks for listening to Messy Liberation.
Will you please take a moment to subscribe, rate, and review wherever you listen?
I know people say that all the time, and if you're like me, often you just go on to the next podcast, but truly, taking that moment to do that will really help us reach a wider audience.
Thank you so much for your support and for listening today.
Until next time.